You glance at your phone. It's 2:13 a.m. You had promised yourself you would go to sleep by midnight, yet here you are, still scrolling. The blue light casts ghostly shadows across your bedroom as your thumb mechanically swipes upward. Just one more video, one more post, one more dopamine hit. But why can't you stop? What if I told you this moment, this seemingly innocent private decision, was designed by teams of neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, and data analysts working in concert to hijack the very neural pathways that evolved to keep you alive? That your inability to put down the phone isn't a personal failure but the successful execution of an algorithmic strategy worth billions? Every day you make approximately 35,000 decisions. You likely believe most of them are conscious, rational choices that reflect your authentic desires and values. But science tells us something far more unsettling. An estimated 95% of your behavior runs on autopilot, guided by subconscious processes you cannot detect. Your brain, magnificently complex yet fundamentally efficient, operates largely beyond your awareness. And this hidden machinery is precisely what makes you vulnerable to manipulation. This is not conspiracy. This is neuroscience. This is behavioral economics. This is the invisible architecture of influence that shapes your daily life more profoundly than any law or mandate ever could. Welcome to the science of manipulation, a world where nothing is quite as voluntary as it seems. In 1957, market researcher James Vickery claimed he had increased Coca-Cola sales by 18.1% and popcorn sales by 57.8% at a movie theater in Fort Lee, New Jersey. His secret? Flashing subliminal messages, drink Coca-Cola and eat popcorn, for just 1/3000th of a second during film screenings. These messages, invisible to conscious awareness, supposedly bypassed rational thought and planted commands directly into viewers' subconscious minds. Vickery's experiment caused immediate panic. Congressional hearings were held. Legislation was drafted. The CIA investigated subliminal messaging as a potential mind control technique. There was just one problem. Vickery had fabricated the entire study. When challenged to replicate his findings, he couldn't. The theater he claimed to use had insufficient equipment for such precise timing. The sample sizes didn't add up. Vickery later admitted the deception, but by then the damage was done. The public believed in the omnipotent power of subliminal influence. While Vickery's specific claims were fraudulent, he had stumbled onto something true. Our minds can indeed be influenced without our awareness. The mechanisms are subtler, more complex, and far more scientifically validated than his crude flashing images, and they're at work in your life right now. Dr. Robert Levin, a cognitive neuroscientist at Stanford University, explains, the brain processes approximately 11 million bits of information every second, but consciousness can handle only about 50 bits per second. That means 99.9995% of what your brain processes never reaches conscious awareness. This gap between processing and awareness creates the perfect conditions for influence without consent. Consider a modest experiment conducted in 1974 by psychologist Gordon Jeffreys at a British Columbia University. Jeffreys placed two identical tip jars at a campus coffee shop counter. Above one jar, he hung a poster showing eyes looking directly at customers. The other jar sat beneath a poster of flowers. Over 6 weeks, the jar under the watching eyes received 276% more tips, despite identical service and no explicit instruction to tip. The mere suggestion of being watched triggered reciprocity and social conformity, Jeffreys noted. The customers felt unconsciously compelled to behave more generously when they sensed they were being observed, even by a non-sentient image. This might seem like an amusing psychological quirk, until you realize that modern influence techniques have evolved far beyond crude posters. Today's manipulation architectures are algorithmic, personalized, and nearly impossible to detect. They don't just suggest, they predict, adapt, and reshape your environment in real time based on your vulnerabilities. Which brings us to a question that will guide our exploration. If simple environmental cues can unconsciously alter your behavior, what happens when sophisticated systems are specifically engineered to exploit the shortcuts in your neural circuitry? And more urgently, how can you protect your autonomy when you don't even notice it's being compromised? To answer these questions, we need to venture deep into the landscape of your unconscious mind. We need to examine not just what manipulates you, but how and why these tactics work. Because the first step to reclaiming your agency is understanding precisely how it's being undermined. The human brain evolved over millions of years to solve specific problems in environments radically different from today's world. Our neural architecture was optimized for survival on the savanna, detecting predators, finding food, forming social bonds, and reproducing. This evolutionary heritage bestowed upon us a collection of mental shortcuts called cognitive heuristics, which allow us to make fast decisions without exhausting our limited cognitive resources. These heuristics are like computational shortcuts, explains Dr. Rachel Langston, a neuropsychologist at MIT. They're energy-efficient ways to reach conclusions without having to process everything. In our ancestral environment, this efficiency was adaptive. If you heard a rustle in the grass, it was better to assume dangerous predator and run than to carefully analyze all possible causes of the sound. In 1974, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman revolutionized our understanding of decision-making by documenting these cognitive shortcuts and the predictable errors or biases they produce. Their work, which eventually earned Kahneman a Nobel Prize, revealed that human reasoning systematically deviates from rationality in ways that can be anticipated and exploited. One fundamental heuristic is the availability bias. We judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. This is why people often fear plane crashes more than car accidents, despite the latter being vastly more common. The vivid, dramatic nature of plane crashes makes them easier to recall, distorting our risk assessment. Marketers have weaponized availability bias for decades, notes consumer psychologist Dr. Thomas Reynolds. When a shampoo commercial shows luxurious hair, they're ensuring that this image will be readily available in your memory when you're standing in the store aisle. You're not consciously thinking, "I recall that commercial," but the neural pathway has been primed. Another powerful shortcut is anchoring, our tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered. In a classic study, participants were asked whether the percentage of African nations in the United Nations was higher or lower than a randomly generated number, either 10% or 65%. When later asked to estimate the actual percentage, those initially shown 10% guessed an average of 25%, while those shown 65% guessed around 45%. The arbitrary initial number anchored their estimates, despite having no informational value. Watch what happens during a negotiation, says Dr. George Jenner, behavioral economist at Columbia University. The side that puts the first number on the table often gains an advantage because that number becomes the anchor around which the entire negotiation revolves. This happens subconsciously, even when people are explicitly told to disregard the initial number. The social proof heuristic causes us to look to others' behavior for guidance, especially in ambiguous situations. In a famous experiment, psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated that people would deny the evidence of their own eyes when confronted with group consensus. When placed in a room with Confederates who unanimously gave an obviously wrong answer about the length of lines on a card, 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving the incorrect answer they knew was false. Social proof explains everything from laugh tracks on television shows to testimonials in advertisements, says sociologist Dr. Emma Richardson. When we see others, particularly those we perceive as similar to us, endorsing something, our brains automatically flag it as more trustworthy. Perhaps most insidious is the illusion of attention, our mistaken belief that we notice everything in our visual field. In reality, we experience substantial inattentional blindness to stimuli right before our eyes when our attention is directed elsewhere. The famous invisible gorilla experiment by psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons demonstrates this dramatically. Participants instructed to count basketball passes in a video overwhelmingly failed to notice a person in a gorilla costume walking through the scene, beating their chest directly in the center of the frame. About 50% of viewers missed the gorilla entirely, despite looking right at it. We don't just miss details, Dr. Simons explains. We miss fully visible, unexpected objects and events when our attention is elsewhere. And crucially, we have no idea how much we're missing. The brain fills in these gaps seamlessly, creating a compelling illusion of complete awareness. This illusion becomes particularly dangerous when combined with another phenomenon: change blindness. In laboratory studies, experimenters have approached strangers asking for directions, only to be replaced by different people during the interaction via various distractions. Remarkably, around 50% of participants failed to notice they were suddenly speaking to an entirely different person. We think we're fully monitoring our environment, notes Dr. Levin, but in reality, we only track what we believe is important. Everything else gets filtered at the subconscious level. This creates massive blind spots that can be exploited. These cognitive shortcuts, availability, anchoring, social proof, and attention blindness, represent just a fraction of the heuristics that influence your daily decisions. They evolved as adaptive mechanisms, but in our complex modern world, they often lead us astray. And as we're about to discover, an entire industry has developed around exploiting these mental vulnerabilities. As you walk through a typical grocery store, you're being manipulated by design elements so subtle you've likely never noticed them, yet so powerful they can increase your spending by 40% or more. Consider the humble shopping cart. In 1937, grocery store owner Sylvan Goldman invented the shopping cart because customers stopped buying when their baskets became too heavy. The seemingly helpful innovation had an unintended consequence. People bought more, a lot more. The shopping cart eliminated the physical constraint on purchasing, explains retail anthropologist Dr. Paco Underhill. But modern carts have been engineered with specific dimensions based on consumer psychology research. Since the 1970s, cart sizes have doubled, and so has the average amount customers purchase per visit. More recently, researchers discovered that doubling the size of shopping carts led to a 37% increase in purchases. This finding sparked a subtle redesign wave across America. Today's carts are 40% larger than those from the 1980s. But the manipulation begins before you even touch a cart. The moment you enter most grocery stores, you encounter the decompression zone, an intentionally open space designed to slow your walking pace. Retailers know that shoppers who move quickly through a store spend less than those who move slowly. By forcing you to adjust from outside walking speed to browsing speed, they're literally changing your brain state from goal-directed to exploratory. The decompression zone resets your attention, says consumer behaviorist Dr. Victoria Simmons. Research shows that information presented in the first 10 feet of a store is essentially invisible to shoppers. Their perceptual systems are too overwhelmed by the transition. That's why you'll never find high-margin goods right at the entrance. After the decompression zone, you're typically directed counterclockwise through the store. This isn't random. Research from Path Intelligence, which tracks shopper movements via cell phone signals, found that people spend 7% more when moving counterclockwise. The effect appears related to our tendency to look slightly leftward when moving forward, meaning items on the right side of counterclockwise aisles receive more visual attention. We've eye-tracked thousands of shoppers, says retail consultant Martin Lindstrom. When moving counterclockwise, people spend an average of 25 more seconds looking at merchandise per aisle compared to clockwise movement. Then there's the product placement. Essentials like milk and eggs are strategically positioned at the back of the store, forcing you to pass hundreds of other products. The most profitable items sit at eye level, while lower-margin products are placed on lower shelves. Children's products are positioned at their eye level, about 3 feet from the ground. Eye tracking studies show that shoppers who look at items at eye level are 40% more likely to purchase them than items they have to look up or down to see. Notes Dr. Jenner. The central eye-level shelves in an aisle are such valuable real estate that manufacturers pay slotting fees, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, just to position their products there. Even the flooring is designed to manipulate your pace. Have you noticed that flooring often changes between departments? This intentional design element, known as pacing pavement, uses different textures and materials to subconsciously regulate your walking speed. Smooth, hard surfaces in the main aisles encourage faster movement, while softer flooring in high-margin departments like cosmetics or electronics encourages lingering. In our experiments with flooring materials, says Dr. Underhill, we found that changing from tile to carpet reduced walking speed by approximately 17% and increased product interaction by 21%. Shoppers don't consciously notice the transition, but their bodies respond to it. Perhaps the most subtle manipulation occurs through sensory marketing. The smell of fresh bread, intentionally vented throughout the store, doesn't just sell bread. It increases overall purchasing by triggering hunger and comfort associations. Similarly, grocery chains carefully select music based on their target demographic and desired shopping pace. Slow music, below 72 BPM, increases dwell time and purchasing by approximately 38% compared to fast music, according to research published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology. The Muzak Corporation created an entire science around this, explains music psychologist Dr. Adrian North. They called it stimulus progression, carefully engineered playlists designed to influence consumer behavior throughout the day. The tempo, volume, and genre would change hour by hour to optimize customer spending depending on traffic patterns. These manipulations extend to pricing psychology as well. The ubiquitous $9.99 price tag instead of $10 exploits what psychologists call the left digit effect. When we read prices, our brains encode the first digit before fully processing the price, creating a disproportionate impression. In experiments by marketing professor Robert Schindler, prices ending in 0.99 increased purchases by 24% compared to rounded prices, even when the 0.99 version was actually higher than a competing product. It's not just about appearing cheaper, clarifies Schindler. The 0.99 ending has come to signal discount in consumer consciousness. When we see it, our brains activate differently than when we see rounded prices, which signal premium or quality instead. Even the receipts are designed to manipulate future behavior. Many major retailers now print targeted coupons on receipts based on your current purchases, using predictive algorithms to identify what you might buy next. CVS's famously long receipts leverage a psychological principle called the endowment effect. Once we possess something, like a coupon, we attribute greater value to it and feel loss if we don't use it. These aren't just random discounts, explains data scientist Dr. Marcus Chun. The algorithms analyze thousands of basket combinations to identify purchasing sequences. If you buy diapers, you might get a coupon for baby food. Buy a garden hose, you might get one for plant fertilizer. Each prediction gets more accurate as the system learns. Perhaps most concerning is what you don't see: dynamically personalized pricing. With digital price tags now common in many chains, prices can be adjusted in real time based on various factors, including information retailers gather about you personally. Some grocery chains are already experimenting with Bluetooth beacons that recognize returning customers through their phone signature, reveals consumer privacy advocate Samantha Miller. Combined with payment data and loyalty programs, they can potentially adjust prices based on your purchasing history, zip code, or even how desperately they predict you need a product. The grocery store represents just one environment engineered to influence your behavior. Similar psychological architecture surrounds you in shopping malls, restaurants, airports, and online spaces, each fine-tuned to guide your choices while maintaining the comforting illusion that you're in complete control. Now that we've glimpsed how physical spaces can be designed to manipulate behavior, let's examine the even more sophisticated techniques used in digital environments. The smartphone in your pocket and the apps you use daily aren't just tools. They're Skinner boxes meticulously engineered to capture and hold your attention. B.F. Skinner, the pioneering behaviorist, created chambers where animals would press levers to receive rewards on different schedules. He discovered that unpredictable, variable rewards were far more effective at driving continued behavior than consistent ones. A rat that received food pellets at random intervals would press a lever obsessively, whereas rats receiving predictable rewards would engage only when hungry. Modern social media platforms are essentially Skinner boxes for humans, observes Dr. Tristan Harris, former design ethicist at Google. The pull-to-refresh gesture is a lever. Sometimes you're rewarded with new content, sometimes not, creating the exact variable reward schedule that maximizes compulsive use. This design isn't accidental. In 2017, Facebook's founding president Sean Parker admitted, "The thought process was, how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible?" He described the platform's features as exploit ing, a vulnerability in human psychology, by creating a social validation feedback loop. The attention economy runs on what neuroscientists call the dopamine reward pathway, the same brain circuit involved in addiction. Each notification, like, or new content item triggers a small dopamine release, training you to check your device compulsively. A 2018 study published in Neuroregulation found that smartphone patterns of use closely mimic the neural signatures of substance dependence. What makes this particularly effective is the reward prediction error principle, explains neuroscientist Dr. Anna Lemke. When we receive a reward that's better than expected, dopamine neurons fire more strongly than if the reward was predictable. Social media deliberately creates unpredictability. You never know if your next refresh will bring something amazing or nothing at all. This unpredictability extends to algorithmic content delivery. TikTok's algorithm, perhaps the most advanced attention-capturing system ever created, monitors dozens of user engagement signals. How long you watch each video, whether you share it, what time of day you're active, and even how long you hover over certain content without interacting. The TikTok algorithm doesn't just show you what you want, clarifies AI researcher Dr. Guillaume Chaslot. It systematically tests different content types to map your psychological triggers with extraordinary precision, then exploits this knowledge to maximize watch time. The effectiveness of these techniques is staggering. In 2020, users spent an average of 52 minutes daily on TikTok, with teenagers averaging 80 minutes. By 2023, those numbers had increased to 95 minutes daily across all age groups. Even more concerning is the employment of what programmers call dark patterns, user interface designs that trick users into actions they wouldn't otherwise take. Examples include hiding unsubscribe buttons, making cancellation processes unnecessarily complex, or using visual misdirection to obtain consent for data collection. Dark patterns work by exploiting cognitive biases, explains UX researcher Harry Brignall, who coined the term in 2010. For instance, the Roach Motel pattern makes it easy to get into a situation but difficult to get out, like hotel subscription services with one-click sign-up but cancellation policies requiring phone calls during specific hours. A particularly effective dark pattern is the false hierarchy, where visually prominent buttons encourage one choice while alternatives are de-emphasized. When Facebook implemented GDPR compliance in Europe, the Accept All button was blue and prominent, while the option to limit data collection was gray text that didn't appear to be clickable. Research by the Norwegian Consumer Council found this design led to 261% higher consent rates compared to interfaces presenting choices equally. Another powerful technique is artificial scarcity. When Booking.com shows messages like, "Only 2 rooms left," or 15 people looking at this right now, they're leveraging loss aversion, the psychological principle that losses feel more significant than equivalent gains. The anxiety these alerts create drives immediate action. The interesting thing about these scarcity messages is that they're often algorithmically generated or manipulated, notes consumer protection attorney Finn Jenkins. There's rarely verification that the numbers shown accurately reflect reality. Perhaps most disquieting is the rise of emotion prediction algorithms. Companies like Affectiva and Realize have developed AI systems that analyze facial expressions through webcams to detect emotional states. These technologies, often embedded in apps and websites without clear disclosure, allow companies to optimize content based on your emotional reactions. The holy grail of attention engineering is emotional state manipulation, warns AI ethics researcher Dr. Julia Kramer. If an algorithm can detect when you're feeling vulnerable, lonely, or insecure, it can serve content specifically designed to exploit those emotional states, whether to sell products or simply keep you engaged longer. This manipulation extends to search results and recommendation systems. In 2013, Robert Epstein and Ronald Robertson demonstrated what they called the search engine manipulation effect, SEME. They found that biased search results could shift voting preferences of undecided voters by 20% or more, with users completely unaware they were being influenced. What's more, this effect was resistant to correction even when participants were explicitly warned about potential bias. What makes algorithmic manipulation so powerful is its invisibility, Epstein explains. Traditional persuasion is overt. You know someone is trying to convince you. But when Google quietly shifts search results, or YouTube's algorithm recommends increasingly extreme content, you perceive it as your own discovery process. The sophistication of these systems continues to advance. Netflix famously tests different thumbnail images for the same content based on your viewing history. If you watch romances, you might see the romantic subplot highlighted in the thumbnail for an action movie. If you watch comedies, the same movie will appear with a humorous moment featured. These systems don't just predict what you'll like, notes data scientist Miranda Kim. They actively shape your preferences by controlling what options you see and how those options are presented. Over time, this narrows your exposure while creating the illusion of free choice. The consequences of these attention capture systems extend beyond mere distraction. A 2018 study by psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania found causal evidence that limiting social media use to 30 minutes per day led to significant reductions in loneliness and depression. Other research has linked smartphone addiction to decreased cognitive capacity, impaired sleep, increased anxiety, and diminished face-to-face social skills. We're conducting an unprecedented experiment on the human psyche, warns Dr. Langston. Never before have attention-harvesting technologies had such reach and sophistication, nor have they been deployed against populations still developing their cognitive capacities, like children and adolescents. As powerful as these digital manipulation techniques are, they represent just one facet of the influence architecture surrounding us. To understand how truly pervasive these forces are, we must examine how language itself can be weaponized to shape thought and behavior. The words you encounter daily, in news headlines, product descriptions, political speeches, and casual conversations, are often carefully engineered to bypass your rational defenses and implant ideas directly into your subconscious. This linguistic manipulation operates through several mechanisms, each exploiting specific features of how your brain processes language. Consider the phenomenon of presupposition, embedding assumptions within sentence structure so they bypass critical evaluation. When a shampoo commercial asks, "Why do more dermatologists recommend brand X?" your brain automatically accepts that more dermatologists do indeed recommend it, even when this claim is unsubstantiated. The question format smuggles in the assertion without triggering your skepticism. Presupposition works because the brain processes the embedded claim as background information rather than as the main assertion being made, explains linguist Dr. Steven Pinker. It's like a cognitive blind spot. We focus on answering the question rather than questioning its premise. This technique appears constantly in political discourse. When a politician asks, How will we pay for the damage caused by my opponent's policies? They're presupposing their opponent's policies are damaging without having to defend this assertion. Your brain accepts the embedded claim while engaging with the surface question. Equally powerful is framing, presenting information in a way that evokes particular associations. In a classic study by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, doctors were more likely to choose a treatment described as saving 200 out of 600 patients than one described as 400 out of 600 patients will die, despite these being mathematically identical statements. Framing works by activating specific neural networks in the brain, explains cognitive scientist Dr. George Lakoff. When we encounter the frame tax relief, for instance, it activates the conceptual frame of an affliction that requires relief, casting taxes as a burden rather than a civic contribution. Once activated, these frames filter how we process subsequent information. The power of framing explains why political consultants invest enormous resources in language development. When conservatives rebranded the estate tax as the death tax, public support for the policy dropped by 30%. Similarly, support for welfare increases significantly when researchers instead call it assistance to the poor. Another linguistic manipulation technique is nominalization, turning processes into things by making verbs into nouns. Compare, we determined that costs must be reduced, with our determination is that cost reduction is necessary. The second version removes human agency, making the action seem inevitable rather than a choice made by specific individuals. Nominalization serves to mystify responsibility, notes linguist Dr. Natalie Richards. It creates the impression of objective forces at work rather than human decisions. This is why corporate and bureaucratic language is filled with nominalizations like consideration will be given instead of we will consider. Perhaps the most insidious linguistic manipulation occurs through strategic ambiguity, deliberately using vague language that different audiences interpret differently. Political scientist Dr. William Riker called this hair-aesthetics, structuring communications so diverse groups all believe the message supports their position. Strategic ambiguity allows communicators to make seemingly specific statements while maintaining plausible deniability, explains political communications researcher Dr. Kathleen Hall Jameson. The phrase "we support common-sense gun laws" activates entirely different mental models for gun rights advocates and gun control supporters, with each group believing their interpretation is the obvious one. This technique appears regularly in corporate communications, political campaigns, and advertising. The slogan "Just do it" works precisely because it can mean whatever the audience wants it to mean, from athletic achievement to personal rebellion to simple product purchase. Equally manipulative is the linguistic device called conversational implicature, communicating ideas without explicitly stating them, so the audience reaches the intended conclusion themselves. When a cereal box says, "now with less sugar," it implies the product was previously unhealthy without making this potentially damaging admission. Implicature is particularly effective because ideas we generate ourselves feel more convincing than ideas others tell us. Notes persuasion researcher Dr. Robert Cialdini. When the audience connects the dots themselves, they experience what psychologists call the illusion of causality, the false belief that they reached the conclusion through independent reasoning rather than guided suggestion. These linguistic manipulations become even more powerful when combined with narrative transportation, the state of being cognitively and emotionally absorbed in a story. Research by psychologists Melanie Green and Timothy Brock has shown that the more immersed people become in narratives, the less they scrutinize the messages embedded within them. When we're transported by a story, our critical faculties diminish, explains Dr. Green. We're less likely to generate counterarguments or notice logical fallacies. This is why propaganda throughout history has relied heavily on narrative forms rather than explicit arguments. This effect helps explain why certain conspiracy theories spread so effectively despite logical inconsistencies. The narrative coherence, how well the story hangs together emotionally, often matters more to our brains than factual accuracy. Our neural architecture evolved to prioritize good stories over good data. The true power of linguistic manipulation becomes apparent when these techniques are deployed in combination. Consider how pharmaceutical companies describe medications in television commercials. They use presupposition, when your regular pain reliever isn't enough, framing, for powerful relief, nominalization, improvement was seen in as little as 30 minutes, strategic ambiguity, may help reduce symptoms, and narrative transportation, showing people happily engaged in activities, all within a single 60-second advertisement. These combined techniques create what we call persuasion cascades, explains Dr. Levin. Each linguistic device weakens a different aspect of critical thinking, making it extraordinarily difficult for even educated consumers to maintain rational evaluation. Perhaps most concerning is evidence that repeated exposure to manipulative language patterns actually reshapes neural pathways over time. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, means that linguistic frames encountered repeatedly become the default architecture through which we interpret reality. The more you hear taxation described as burden, the more your neural networks physically restructure to encode this association, says Dr. Lakoff. Eventually, you cannot think about the concept without activating the frame, regardless of your conscious political positions. This explains why countering linguistic manipulation is so difficult. Simply being aware of these techniques provides limited protection because they operate primarily through automatic, unconscious processing. By the time your conscious mind engages, the language has already activated specific neural patterns and emotional associations. The science of influence extends far beyond manipulating attention and language. Perhaps the most profound control mechanisms operate at the level of identity itself, shaping how you understand who you are and your place in the social world. Identity is not a fixed characteristic but a dynamic construct that responds to environmental cues, explains social psychologist Dr. Claude Steele. What makes identity so vulnerable to manipulation is that much of it operates outside conscious awareness while fundamentally directing behavior. Steele's groundbreaking research on stereotype threat demonstrates how subtle identity cues can dramatically affect performance. In one study, when women were reminded of gender stereotypes before a math test by simply marking their gender on a form, their scores dropped significantly compared to women who weren't given this identity prime. Similar effects appear across various domains. Research participants perform worse on intelligence tests when their racial identity is made salient before testing. Elderly participants walk more slowly after being exposed to words associated with aging. Asian American women perform better on math tests when their Asian identity is activated but worse when their gender identity is activated. What's happening in these cases is identity shift, clarifies Dr. Langston. Different facets of our identities become more or less accessible depending on contextual cues, and each identity facet carries associated behavioral scripts and expectations. This malleability of identity explains why tribal affiliations, from political parties to sports teams to brand loyalties, can so powerfully influence behavior. When a particular group identity becomes salient, people unconsciously align their thinking and behavior with perceived group norms. In a revealing 2018 study, researchers presented identical policy proposals to Republicans and Democrats, but randomly assigned them as coming from either the Republican or Democratic Party. Both groups supported the policy approximately 70% more often when it supposedly came from their own party, regardless of content. What's striking isn't just that people favor their in-group, notes political psychologist Dr. Liliana Mason. It's that they reinterpret reality, including their own values and interests, to maintain consistency with their identity. This identity manipulation extends to consumer behavior through what marketers call identity-based marketing. By associating products with specific identity characteristics, companies can bypass rational evaluation of product attributes. When Apple portrays its users as creative and independent, They're not selling computer specifications, explains consumer psychologist Dr. Jennifer Acker. They're selling identity confirmation and signaling. The product becomes a means of telling yourself and others, "This is who I am." This explains why people defend their preferred brands with nearly religious fervor. Criticism of an identity-linked brand registers in brain scans as a personal threat, activating the same neural regions involved in processing physical danger. The brain interprets brand criticism as an attack on the self. Perhaps the most powerful identity manipulation occurs through the establishment of moral tribes. Research by psychologist Dr. Jonathan Haidt demonstrates that moral judgments are primarily intuitive and emotional rather than rational. When a group defines itself through moral positions, it creates powerful in-group/out-group dynamics that override analytical thinking. Once morality enters the equation, rational evaluation diminishes dramatically, explains Haidt. The brain switches from analytical mode to tribal mode, where defending the group's moral position becomes more important than determining what's actually true. This effect is amplified by what psychologists call sacred values, beliefs so fundamental to identity that questioning them feels like a profound violation. Research using functional MRI shows that when sacred values are challenged, the brain suppresses activity in regions associated with rational analysis while activating emotional processing areas. Sacred values create boundaries of thought, notes anthropologist Dr. Scott Atran. They limit what questions can even be contemplated. This makes them extraordinarily powerful tools for manipulation because they effectively disable critical thinking in specific domains. The combination of identity malleability and sacred values creates what sociologist Dr. Zeynep Tufekci calls manufactured consensus. The illusion that certain positions are universally held within a group when they actually represent strategic manipulation. Social media algorithms detect which moral issues generate the strongest engagement and amplify those voices, Tufekci explains. This creates the false impression that extreme positions are mainstream within a group, leading to preference falsification, where people publicly endorse positions they privately question to maintain group belonging. This dynamic explains the phenomenon of preference cascades, where seemingly solid consensus suddenly collapses. When enough individuals realize their private doubts are actually widely shared, the social cost of dissent diminishes, and previously suppressed perspectives emerge rapidly. What looks like sudden opinion change is often the revelation of what people believed all along but were afraid to express, notes political scientist Dr. Timur Kuran. The manipulative power lies in controlling what positions seem acceptable to question. These identity manipulation techniques become even more effective when combined with another psychological phenomenon: cognitive dissonance. When people take small actions aligned with an identity, they subsequently shift their beliefs to maintain consistency with those actions. In the classic 1959 study by psychologists Leon Festinger and James Carl Smith, participants who were paid $1 to tell others they had enjoyed a boring task later rated the task as significantly more interesting than participants paid $20 for the same deception. The smaller payment created dissonance that could only be resolved by genuinely changing their evaluation of the experience. Small, incremental commitments are far more effective at changing identity than direct persuasion, explains Dr. Cialdini. When someone has taken a small action associated with an identity, signing a petition, wearing a badge, making a minor purchase, they begin to see themselves differently and subsequently make increasingly larger commitments consistent with this emerging self-view. This explains why skilled manipulators often begin with trivial requests before escalating to more significant demands. The initial compliance creates identity momentum that makes subsequent requests feel consistent rather than exploitative. The most sophisticated identity manipulation techniques combine all these elements: stereotype threat, tribal affiliations, sacred values, manufactured consensus, and cognitive dissonance into comprehensive influence architectures. Political campaigns, religious organizations, multi-level marketing companies, and brand communities all utilize these mechanisms to reshape how people understand themselves and their choices. What makes identity manipulation so powerful is its invisibility, concludes Dr. Mason. We experience our identities as authentic expressions of who we truly are, not as constructs shaped by environmental cues and social pressures. This perceived authenticity makes us defend these identities fiercely, even when they lead us to act against our own interests. Now that we understand how manipulation works through attention capture, linguistic framing, and identity construction, we face an urgent question. How can we protect our autonomy in a world designed to compromise it? The first step is acknowledging the fundamental asymmetry of the influence landscape. Individual awareness alone is insufficient protection against sophisticated influence systems, cautions Dr. Harris. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. These techniques are developed by teams of psychologists, data scientists, and behavioral economists with resources far beyond any individual's defensive capabilities. This asymmetry explains why simple advice like, just be more mindful, or think critically, offers limited protection. The manipulation systems we've explored operate primarily through automatic, unconscious processes specifically designed to circumvent conscious scrutiny. However, research has identified several evidence-based strategies that can significantly enhance your resistance to unwanted influence. 1. Implementation intentions. Psychologist Dr. Peter Gallwitzer has demonstrated that pre-committed decision rules dramatically reduce vulnerability to manipulation. Rather than relying on in-the-moment willpower, you establish if-then plans. If I enter a store, then I will only buy items on my list. Studies show this approach reduces susceptibility to impulse purchases by up to 80%. 2. Environmental pre-commitment. Removing manipulation triggers from your environment proves more effective than trying to resist them in the moment. Uninstalling social media apps, using website blockers, or leaving credit cards at home when shopping leverages what psychologists call choice architecture. Restructuring your environment to make desired behaviors easier and undesired behaviors harder. 3. Delay tactics. Research by behavioral economist Dr. Dan Ariely shows that even brief decision delays significantly improve choice quality. Implementing mandatory waiting periods before purchases above a certain threshold can reduce regretted decisions by 40%. The emotional activation driving impulse behavior naturally dissipates with time, allowing more rational evaluation. 4. Linguistic reframing. When encountering manipulative language, deliberately relabeling concepts in your mind can disrupt automatic processing. If a politician describes tax cuts as relief, consciously substituting revenue reduction helps neutralize the embedded frame. This technique, called cognitive reappraisal, has been shown to reduce susceptibility to framing effects by up to 60%. 5. Identity diversification. Research by psychologist Dr. Patricia Linville demonstrates that people with more complex, multifaceted identities show greater resilience against identity-based manipulation. By consciously developing and maintaining multiple identity dimensions, professional, creative, relational, civic, etc., you create cognitive circuit breakers that prevent any single identity threat from dominating decision-making. 6. Value articulation. Explicitly defining your core values in writing creates what psychologists call an intertemporal commitment device. When you later encounter manipulative messages targeting those values, the prior articulation serves as a reference point, reducing susceptibility to value distortion. Studies show this approach reduces vulnerability to moral panics and outrage manipulation by approximately 30%. 7. Collective resistance. Perhaps most importantly, research suggests that organizing collective responses to manipulation systems provides far more protection than individual efforts alone. As Dr. Tufekci observes, the most effective defense against attention manipulation isn't individual discipline but collective demand for ethical design. The science is clear that individual awareness, while necessary, cannot fully protect against the sophisticated influence architectures we've explored. The most effective protection comes from combining personal resistance techniques with structural changes to our information environment. The manipulation systems we've discussed aren't inevitable features of technology or markets, emphasizes Dr. Langston. They're design choices that could be made differently if we collectively demanded it. Evidence for this comes from natural experiments where different regulatory approaches have been implemented. The European Union's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and the California Consumer Privacy Act have demonstrated that legal frameworks can significantly alter manipulation landscapes without impeding technological progress. Similarly, countries with regulations limiting certain manipulative marketing practices show measurably different consumer behavior patterns. In Sweden, where advertising to children under 12 is heavily restricted, research shows children demonstrate greater advertising skepticism and less materialistic values compared to similar demographics in less regulated environments. What these examples show is that the choice isn't between accepting manipulation or rejecting technology, clarifies digital ethicist Dr. James Williams. It's about aligning our information systems with human flourishing rather than exploitation. This brings us to the fundamental insight that emerges from our exploration. Manipulation works not because humans are irrational, but because our rationality is contextual. The same cognitive adaptations that enabled our species' survival and cooperation can be systematically exploited when deployed in environments radically different from those in which they evolved. Our brains didn't evolve for digital feeds, algorithm-curated information, or industrialized persuasion, explains evolutionary psychologist Dr. David Buss. They evolved for small group living, direct sensory information, and interpersonal trust. The mismatch between our neural architecture and our current environment creates the vulnerabilities that manipulation exploits. Understanding this mismatch offers a profound reframing. Manipulation resistance isn't about overcoming human nature, but about creating environments that work with rather than against our cognitive architecture. This perspective shift is crucial because it moves us from shame, "I should have more willpower," to empowerment. These systems are designed to override my willpower, and I can demand different designs. It recognizes that the most effective solutions combine personal responsibility with structural change. As we conclude our exploration of the science of manipulation, we arrive at a counterintuitive but evidence-based conclusion. The greatest freedom doesn't come from ignoring the forces that shape our behavior, but from understanding them deeply. Only by recognizing the full extent of our vulnerability can we develop truly effective protections for our autonomy. The manipulation systems surrounding us aren't going away. If anything, they're becoming more sophisticated, more personalized, and more pervasive. But science offers both insight into how they work and evidence-based strategies for resistance. The decision before us isn't whether we'll be influenced, that's inevitable given our neural architecture, but whether we'll allow that influence to remain invisible and unaccountable, or whether we'll bring it into the light of conscious awareness and collective action. Your brain, with its remarkable efficiency shortcuts and social adaptations, will always be vulnerable to manipulation. But that same brain, with its capacity for metacognition, thinking about thinking, gives you the unique ability to notice these influences and, where necessary, counteract them. In a world designed to manipulate, the ultimate act of autonomy is recognizing that pure autonomy is a myth, and then consciously choosing which influences you'll allow to shape the person you become.